Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone. I'm your host, Jack Baker, and welcome to Pangolin, the conservation podcast. So, after our gallivant across the world last week to Brazil to talk about the giant armadillo conservation project, we are coming a little bit closer to home for me, anyway, just down south in England, because we're going to be talking about the Wilder Blean project, a rewilding project which is aiming to reintroduce bison into the UK countryside. It's a really interesting project. I've got Vicki Breakell of the Wildwood Trust is going to be joining me very shortly to talk a little bit about this project and their role in it, as well as the role of the other organisations that are involved, and what it is like to try and bring one of these large herbivore species back to the UK. But before we get to that interview, what is rewilding? Probably worth for covering, just in case some of you are listening to me thinking I sound totally insane or have no idea what I am talking about. So, rewilding is a form of environmental conservation and ecological restoration. Rewilding aims to do this by reintroducing a very environmentally influential but lost animal species to natural environments. So, unlike simply reintroducing a species, rewilding targets species for reintroduction that will have positive knock-on effects for everything around them. So these species could be known as ecosystem engineers, like we covered in season 1 with the pangolin, or they can be known as keystone species, kind of meaning that they are the species which holds the environment together, and without them, the environment has started to kind of collapse and fall to bits. These species, they can take many forms. They can be small creatures like beavers, which have been reintroduced to Scotland because obviously they turn over a lot of plant matter and kind of affect the waterways. Or they can be large herbivores, like we're about to discuss with the bison. Additionally, rewilding also often targets apex predator species, so things like wolves, because by reintroducing predator species, the rest of the food chain is kind of kept in check, and populations of prey species are not able to overwhelm the system in which they exist because there is another species above them kind of keeping their numbers down. So that is the concept of rewilding, kind of summed up in as few words as possible. But before we get on to the interview, I'm going to tell you a little bit about a really famous example, which I find really, really interesting, which is the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone National Park in the United States. So, wolves were once native to this national park until good old humans hunted them to extinction. So, in 1995, the wolves were reintroduced as part of a rewilding initiative, and something really interesting happened. So, it was known as a trophic cascade because basically they reintroduced the wolves at the top of this kind of food chain, and all of these effects cascaded down, and everything kind of in the environment was affected. So first, you reintroduce the wolves, and they kind of really have a massive effect on the large herbivore species that they want to hunt. So things like deer avoided certain areas of the park and moved in very different ways, so they would kind of have less of an impact on the plants. When plants were less affected by deer, they had more of a chance to grow, they had more of a chance to kind of blossom and sprout and spread and kind of change in different ways and grow in different ways. And that encouraged a couple things to happen. Not only does it provide more areas for small species and insects and pollinators to kind of live and thrive, it also affects the waterways because the roots of plants hold the riverbanks together, they prevent the degradation of the soil, and so they change the riverways, and the kind of waterways all began to change as well. So simply by reintroducing the wolves at the top, I say simply, probably not that simply, probably very complicated, but by putting the wolves back in at the top, you kind of affect the large herbivores, then the smaller species, and the pollinators, and the plants, and the animals, and then eventually you get to the landscape itself begins to change, and it becomes a much healthier and positive environment. And this is globally renowned as one of the best examples, most common examples of a successful rewilding story, which I think is the type of thing that will have inspired Vicki and the Wilder Blean project to make a shot of this bison reintroduction in the UK. So really, Vicki is the best person to talk about this. She is working on the project. She was one of the people who went out and viewed the bison, learned from places that have already done this kind of project to how to do it and how to do it successfully. So I will let her talk now. I really hope you enjoy the interview, and I will be back at the end of the show to sign off. So yes, thank you very much for listening, and I really hope you enjoy today's interview with Vicki Breakell of the Wildwood Trust. welcome back to the show. I am now joined by Vicki Breakell, a Conservation Officer for the Wildwood Trust. She is here to talk to us about their Wilder Blean project, which, as part of the growing rewilding movement, plans to introduce bison into a contained area of the English countryside. So thank you very much for joining us today, Vicki.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. I guess the first thing would be good for our listeners to get to know you a little bit. So could you introduce yourself and tell the audience a little bit about your background?
Of course. So, like you say, I'm a conservation officer at the Wildwood Trust, and the Wildwood Trust, if you haven't heard of it as before, is a wildlife park or a wildlife conservation charity set within a 40-acre wildlife park. And our focus is British native species. So we've got the charismatic red fox, badgers, red squirrels, all the cute stuff. But also we've sort of gone back in time a little bit. So we've got some of the species that used to be here, like brown bears, Eurasian lynx, European wolves, for example. And it's, a very we attract a huge number of visitors each year, and sort of behind the scenes, what we have going on is a lot of conservation work as well. So I've been very fortunate to be working here since 2009. Actually, I graduated from the University of Kent under their Durrell Institute of Conservation and Ecology department, and graduated in 2008, and then I started volunteering with Wildwood, and I was very fortunate enough to be offered a job as their water vole keeper. So that's where my conservation career started, really. Started with very small critters, the water voles, and dealt with their sort of captive breeding reintroduction program, as well as sort of assisting with consultancy or mitigation projects. And sort of my job sort of evolved over time, and I then got sort of made up to conservation officer, which then meant I was involved with a number of different projects. One example was the conic conservation grazing. I was sort of overseeing the management of that, and more recently I've sort of been assisting with one of our collaborative projects, the Wilder Blean project, which is in collaboration with Kent Wildlife Trust, and it's been funded by the People's Postcode Lottery, their dream fund. So it's a hugely exciting project, and yes, I'm very excited to be here to tell you all about it.
Perfect. Thank you very, very much. That's such a good introduction, because it touches on so many things that I think I want to come back to throughout the interview, because there is so many different aspects to this project and to the things that you've done previously. And I think just to start off, you touched on it there. It would be kind of worthwhile touching on the Water Vole project that you worked on before. Now, I read a little bit about how it was a reintroduction project, and I wondered if you could tell the listeners a little bit more about that, because I think a lot of people don't know this. I was actually, when I was doing the research for the interview, I didn't even know. I went onto the Wildlife Trust's website, and they say it's Britain's fastest declining wild mammal. So I don't think, and it's not something that gets an awful lot of attention. So could you tell us a little bit more about that project as well?
Cool. I could talk about water voles for hours, but yes, they're a charismatic little species. But yeah, I mean, what you said is correct. They've gone through this massive decline, and what's quite remarkable is that they are a rodent species. So when you think of rodents, you think about them, potentially breeding high numbers of individuals, and so in theory, their populations should be booming, not declining. And so that's what made it quite alarming. And it was in 2008 that they realised, after 2 national surveys that had highlighted an 88% decline, which is huge, they then received full protection. And so with full protection, it meant that any development work or infrastructure maintenance or anything that was going to affect a water vole population, because of their full protection, it meant that they couldn't just simply be forgotten about. They had to be mitigated for. So the water voles would have to be sort of relocated from that particular site, taken to somewhere safe, or relocated to another site. And that's kind of where we came into it at Wildwood. So we provide sort of temporary accommodation, as it were, for water vole populations. So we would obviously work alongside the environmental consultants. They would have to apply for licenses for this work, and that's all through Natural England in our case. Once the license is approved, we could then look after those water voles once they're removed from site. We could even look to breed from them if needed. Increase the numbers, which is, great if we can put back more than what came off the site originally. And then the consultants, can't simply forget about them. They'd have to reinstate habitat for them to go back to, or find a receptor site, so another site that can take the water voles, and then those water voles would go back to that site, and that's a nice sort of cycle process to facilitate some development work to happen, which has to happen, is a last resort to remove the water voles from site. But it also means, we can look to increase those numbers and then make a positive impact on the population that then is returned. The other side to what we do is captive breeding for reintroduction. So a lot of the time we're contacted by people that have got suitable sites, or feel that their site could support a population of water voles, and it is quite a lengthy process, and it can take years potentially. We'd start off by doing site surveys. We'd understand why water voles there weren't there already, whether it was American mink, for example, which has had a devastating impact on water vole numbers, or if it was just the habitat isn't quite right, and we can make recommendations and really sort of advise the landowner or land manager, and then we can do the actual reintroduction, and we go obviously we follow all the IUCN reintroduction guidelines, and we install release pens for those individuals, and then we do post-release monitoring and all that kind of stuff. So I was very fortunate to be able to be involved in all aspects of water voles, and yeah, like I said, it's kind of where I started. So they do hold my heart. They are a fantastic little species, and the best way to think of them is like miniature beavers. So you think of an impact that a beaver can have. Well, if you've got a good population of water voles, they can have a similar sort of impact on a smaller scale. So yeah, definitely worth championing and saving.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting, because I think, especially for me, when people always kind of ask me about, conservation, like you want to do your dissertation on something like elephants or whales or polar bears or something of these big kind of well-publicized species, I think people often forget about the little things and how important those little things can be. And I guess kind of something you said there that I wanted to kind of touch upon then is taking the lessons you learned from the smaller species and transferring it across to what you're now working on, which, of course, much larger species, the bison. Especially, I guess something you said there, which really stuck with me, was it took a few years to kind of work through processes with a small species, which I think is relatively inoffensive. Nobody feels endangered no one feels like a water vole is going to ruin anything or scare anybody or do anything. So what was the kind of transfer process of working with these smaller animals and then moving to a larger animal like the bison? Was it even more challenging working with these larger animals?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. The water voles are fairly, on the scale of when you're sort of looking at wilding programs, there's always talk of Eurasian lynx, for example, being released in Britain, which has been mentioned, and potentially further down the line is being sort of explored, and that's obviously quite tricky. There's a lot of things you need to cover to get that project to go through. But with water voles, the time it takes is generally to get the site suitable. So it's not so much the actual logistics or the process of doing the reintroduction. That's fairly straightforward, and because it's been a practice that has taken place over a number of years, we've all we learned from best practice, and so it's quite it's fairly straightforward. But it is the time it takes is working with those land managers and landowners, and sort of just making sure that site is 100% suitable, or as suitable as it can be, to support that population, because you've got a duty of care for those animals that you're releasing. You need to look after them, and you need to make sure that they're going out to a place where they're going to flourish. So with regards to sort of take home points from that sort of conservation project that then sort of reflects on the Blean project, it's essential that you have that planning procedures in place. So you have a well thought out project, you've got a suitable site, you've done your research, and for example, for the Blean project, Kent Wildlife Trust and Wildwood Trust, because this is a joint collaboration, we actually went to the Netherlands and we looked at two European bison semi-wild projects over in Europe, to really sort of get learn more about the project and the nitty-gritty details, their vet regime and how they do their look for welfare condition scoring and all that kind of stuff, and how they manage them on a day-to-day basis, and just really sort of get an idea of how that project works. So planning is essential and research is essential. Another sort of take-home point from sort of looking at the Water Vole reintroduction programs is really sort of working with people that are directly involved and bringing them along on the same journey. So then they fully support it and they fully understand it, and they can really sort of they want to contribute to the project. And that's been an absolutely essential part for the Wilder Blean, in that there's been a very robust sort of stakeholder engagement process where anyone with an interest or who potentially could be affected by the Blean project is being consulted with and being told or being invited to have conversations about the project and how they can how we can really work together to make the project a success. So there's a couple of sort of take-home points really, from which are transferable skill sets really for either project. Keeping people involved and making sure you plan.
Yes, both very important, especially the collaboration element. I think the more people I speak to, the more you realize just how interconnected everything is, and how even if somebody works on one species in one area of the world, which you think may be completely different to where we are in the UK, the lessons are transferable, and the things that you can kind of maybe even they can then take home as well are very important. I wondered if you could expand a little bit on how this project came about in terms of the relationship between the two organisations involved.
Absolutely. So the collaboration between Kent Wildlife Trust and Wildwood Trust was quite a fluid motion, actually. It was sort of dovetailing our relative experience. So Kent Wildlife Trust obviously manages a whole host of reserves throughout Kent, and Wildwood Trust has the animal expertise. In particular, we've got the European bison within sort of an enclosure at the wildlife park, and so it really sort of, this collaborative project really sort of marries our relative experience together. In addition, the location is fantastic. So we've got Wildwood, which is situated within the Blean ancient woodland, and the reserve actually adjoins our perimeter fence. So, at the top, what we call the top forest is where our European bison are currently situated. That's right next door to where they will be going out, where the new bison will be going out into the Blean. And so it just made perfect sense. And we both organisations have this shared vision of a wilder Kent, and so we're working on a number of collaborative projects, with the Wilder Blean just being one of them. But we're also looking at red-billed chough reintroductions along the Kent coastline, as well as looking at like future projects as well. So we're very, very fortunate that we can sort of working together, and it's going to be an exciting partnership.
Perfect. I think that's something that's really encouraging, I think, to me, and something that I'm really interested in is this idea that two organizations or three or really any number of people with any number of backgrounds can come together and all contribute to this greater idea. We don't all have to exist in these kind of silos. It's not, we work in the same space, but we do our own things. It can actually be more productive to kind of work together.
Absolutely. And you're sharing your resources, you're sharing your knowledge. So like you say, you're not working in a silo, and you're not, reinventing the wheel, as it were. You can both work together in a collaboration and really sort of push projects forward. So yeah, it's a hugely exciting partnership.
I guess that kind of leads nicely on. I wondered, you talked there about how you visited the Netherlands to kind of look at their bison projects. By that point, had the decision already been made as to you were going to be bison were the ones that you were going to kind of choose to introduce in your project, or were you still kind of working things out at that stage and working out, oh, we're kind of still going between a few species?
So, I mean, the European bison had been, at the very beginning of this project. That was the road we wanted to go down. We wanted to use European bison. We then obviously, went on this venture to the Netherlands to then say, right, okay, this is the idea. This is what we think we would like, we think is achievable. We want to go and just visit some other projects and just see how achievable it is and how it can be replicated in the UK, because obviously, projects in Europe are very different from, they're under different restrictions than we would be, sort of, different licensing and that kind of stuff. So we knew there was going to be some differences between the two projects, but we wanted to, get fully sort of understand everything that they need to do to make that project a success. So like you say, we sort of had the idea that European bison was what we wanted to do for our wilding project, for the Wildwood Blean. We then wanted to research it, so we went and visited in the two sites in the Netherlands, and we came away with that with just this huge amount of positivity. I mean, we were obviously guided by the bison rangers that they have on site, so we were under their supervision at all times, but we could actually go and visit the bison within their sort of fenced off enclosure, and just being in close proximity to them in a semi-wild setting was just absolutely amazing. Just watching them naturally grazing and browsing and just doing their bison thing. And they were obviously very aware of us, but they weren't too phased. They were just, they were just very calm, very relaxed. And we were just like, wow, this is absolutely amazing. I mean, we've got 2 European bison at the wildlife park at Wildwood. And obviously, you can see those, you can see them up close, but there's obviously a fence between you and there's definitely a separation between you and them. But the feeling you get from seeing the bison in the semi-wild conditions that we did in the Netherlands, it was just, you can't replicate it. It was just phenomenal. And we thought, if we're feeling this, imagine what everyone else is going to be feeling when we can make this happen. And we had sort of lengthy presentations from the sort of the supervisors of the project, and obviously we had in-depth discussions, and we went over all of the infrastructure requirements and all of their routines and things like that, and how they manage the bison and people, in that sort of safe way. And we just came away just like, yes, we can do this. We can make this work. And it really was like, full speed ahead, kind of, right. Mm-hmm. We know we can make this happen. So it was a hugely positive experience.
That's really interesting, actually. And I love the kind of, it's one of those things that I feel like, I don't know whether it's conservationists, we can find any animal cute and inspiring, but I'm the same with these things, that whenever you see an animal that some people might look at and think, that's quite a big cow, what is the, but I love the, like, going and saying, like, that's amazing, like, and I think, it's a really inspiring kind of take on it. And I guess that emotionally confirmed it in your head, that that's what you were going to do and what you wanted, and this is the thing to move forward with. But I guess on the technical side, what was the kind of ecological appeal of bison beyond the kind of initial impressive connection you had there?
Yeah, so I mean, European bison are fairly unique in the way they interact with their surroundings within their sort of habitat. So They like, obviously, being within woodlands and having sort of open areas as well, sort of a bit of a habitat mosaic for them to sort of forage and sort of graze and browse within. But what's fascinating about bison, when you compare them to, say, domesticated cattle breeds, for example, the Longhorn, is that they feed slightly differently. And it is very subtle, but there is a difference between how bison and, say, Longhorn will browse. So both the Longhorn and bison will complement their diet with 20% woody plant species. So, the really sort of dense stuff that you and I would probably look at and go, cool, that's not very palatable. But what's really interesting is the plant part preference between the two. So, for example, the Longhorn or domesticated cattle breeds will tend to go for the smaller branches, or they'll nibble the edges of the branches, which over time doesn't really have a massive impact on the tree itself. Mm. The European bison feed upon the bark of the tree. So they will end up sort of stripping off sections of bark. This in time will create standing deadwood, ring bark in the tree, then sort of creates this standing deadwood. And that has, huge amount of a benefit for a whole host of different species, invertebrates and birds, for example, that would then use that as a home, as a habitat. Over time, I mean, we are talking, this is small scale, so this isn't deforestation or anything like that. It's a very, very small scale, very natural process. Once you have this sort of standing deadwood, of course, over time, you then end up with that tree falling over, and that creates a clearing within the woodland. And that clearing allows the sunlight to penetrate and get to the ground, and you end up with this regeneration of the sunlight hitting the soil and regenerating those seeds within that seed bank. And that creates a complex habitat. So you end up with this sort of three-dimensional habitat type where you've got regenerating trees and scrub alongside sort of, high forest, for example. And that supports a whole host of biodiversity as well. So it's instigating a natural process, a natural cycle back into the woodland that is missing at the moment. When you go back sort of thousands of years, we used to have a bison here. We used to have the steppe bison here. And the European bison is, the closest sort of relative almost to that bison that was here. So it's kind of fulfilling a bit of a niche in our woodland management. And when you look at the State of Nature report that was published in 2019, it's stated that, we're going through catastrophic biodiversity loss. And one of the biggest drivers, there's 8 biggest drivers, and one of them is woodland management. And, we have a process where that our woodlands are hugely managed by humans, by people, and that's very costly, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of resources, and it's not as natural as if you can use, put a species in there that's going to reinstate those natural processes. And the bison, European bison, is classed as a keystone species, as an ecosystem engineer, and they can really adapt that habitat for the benefit of a whole host of other species. And that's what we're really hoping is going to happen in the Blean. So we're looking to sort of compare and contrast. So like I said, and I sort of compared them to the Longhorn, which is a domesticated cattle breed. So we're looking at doing sort of having 2 separate grazing assemblages within the Blean. So we're going to have the bison, which are going to be put into sort of an enclosed area of the Blean alongside Exmoor ponies and Iron Age pigs. And then we're going to have in a separate section what we call our proxy species. So we're going to have Longhorn cattle, Exmoor ponies and Iron Age pigs. And this, again, is just going to support the sort of initial findings that we know of the difference between the bison and domesticated cattle. but it'll really sort of champion the use of using the European bison, because we're going to have this extensive monitoring program that's put in place, which is looking at vegetation structure, doing biodiversity sampling, looking at a whole range of different taxa, as well as looking at ecosystem services and reinstating natural processes and all that kind of stuff. So it's really valuable that we're going to have this as a bit of a trial almost, comparing these two grazing assemblages that we hope will really sort of champion the use of European bison. There's, of course, a whole conservation story to the use of European bison as well. So they went through a catastrophic bottleneck in the early 1920s. So they were completely extinct in the wild. It was just zoos and wildlife parks that had sort of brought in the remaining European bison, and it ended up with about 54 individuals, which is, for a mammal species, that's unbelievable that it went down to such low numbers. And then from that 54 individuals, only 12 pairs bred. And it's those 12 pairs that have really founded the current European bison population that we have at the moment. And so because of this severe bottleneck, because they've gone through this decline, there's been extensive conservation breeding programs to sort of increase the numbers. And so the bison that we source for this project, for the wild Blean, are going to come through the endangered species European breeding program. So it'll be under the recommendation of the stud book holder, so the person that makes all the judgment calls about who's going to be breeding with who. So we will look to them and say, look, this is the number of bison we need. Can you sort us out? And he will provide those bison for us. We'll then have them, out in the Blean. They'll come from sort of fairly semi-wild conditions, so that they're fairly accustomed to what they're going to be sort of doing in the Blean. But it also means that because we're going to allow the bison to go through natural breeding process, once we've sort of reached capacity, or if we reach capacity, then any surplus offspring can then go back through the breeding program and then get moved on to other projects, which is a nice sort of closed circle really of how the bison are going to sort of be on the Blean. So there's a whole host of elements as to why we want to use the European bison.
Yes, that's really interesting actually, and because I was having a think about that before we jumped on this call today, because I was obviously bison will continue to breed, and then what happens when you reach the capacity when there's no large predator species obviously present in the region? I was kind of intrigued, so I'm glad you answered that without me even having to ask. So yeah, that's really interesting. And I think just for listeners as well, we kind of touched on the idea of ecosystem engineers, and if that rings a bell, that means you have hopefully listened to the first season of the show where we talked about pangolins as ecosystem engineers in Namibia and how they turn over the soil. And it goes to show, I guess, any species, no matter small or large, can have these massive impacts that kind of shape the environments that they're in. Now, moving on a little bit, I wanted to ask about the reception to the project, because I think it's been overwhelming. Certainly for me personally, I don't remember seeing any conservation story in the news, certainly in the UK, in the last year more than this one. And I wondered what the general reception has been like. Has it been generally really, really positive, or have there been some concerns raised, or what has the kind of general reception been?
There's been a huge amount of interest. I mean, when we sort of put together the project announcement, and we were blown away by the amount of media coverage we received for the project. I mean, it was international, and it was absolutely phenomenal. And this was great because it got people talking. It got people talking about European bison. It got people talking about wilding projects. And so, yeah, we were absolutely, like I say, blown away by it all. But the biggest consensus was that people just wanted to learn more. They supported it. They thought it was fantastic. They thought it was really innovative, and just, yeah, we had people emailing just to say this is fantastic. Thank you so much for doing this. And so it's been such a positive response to the project. There was a few people that sort of as soon as you say European bison, and obviously the size of European bison, they were a bit worried, and they partly didn't realize that they were going to be going into an enclosed area within the woods. So they thought, originally they thought it was going to be sort of like free roaming bison in the southeast. But we just reassured them and said, no, this is within an enclosed area. It's within sort of 500 hectares. So it's a good size reserve. And once you sort of explain to people about the nature of bison, I mean, they are a fantastic species, and obviously we're very fortunate at Wildwood that we've got two on site, so we've seen those sort of day in, day out, and we know how they behave and how they interact, and they are hugely popular with our visitors. People love seeing them, and so once you sort of started to speak about the bison and how that how they can really benefit a whole host of different species and the impacts that they can have on the habitat, people then we're like, oh, okay, that's really fantastic. So, thank you so much for explaining that. So yeah, it's been hugely positive, and like I say, we couldn't quite believe how far reaching the media attention we received. It was brilliant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I remember I was looking through the BBC articles and all the kind of UK news sources in preparation for this, and then things came up from, I think it was USA Today and things. I was like, it was just incredible to see how far it had reached, because I wasn't sure. It certainly made its rounds and continues to make rounds in the UK, but it's really encouraging, I think, especially after the last year where I think everybody saw the effect of leaving nature to be nature. They saw increased bird species, they saw increased kind of squirrels or animals in their back gardens and things. I think it's really encouraging to just kind of see these stories start to gain momentum and people really appreciate them. I guess something you mentioned there was that kind of the misconception that there would be these animals wandering around just kind of up and down the streets of England. Kind of people were a bit confused there initially. I wondered what the kind of, in your mind, what the perfect balance then is between these natural spaces and human spaces, and what the perfect balance is between those two spheres.
It's a really good question and a really good point. Sort of we mentioned about free roaming bison in the southeast just isn't really an option, and that's because there's we're quite a crowded corner of England. We've got high population of people, and with bison, obviously there's certain legislation that you have to apply for to sort of keep them, or to have them within an enclosed area. So it's not really feasible to have them free roaming in the southeast. But I think in light of the COVID pandemic that we've had, or that we're going through at the moment, people have really been clinging on to these positive stories, and I think that the Wilder Blean announcement is a great example of that. People really got behind it, and they're like, yes, this is a fantastic, positive conservation story, brilliant. Want to know more? Want to learn more? But I think you're right in that it's trying to find that sort of balance between sort of nature and people, and obviously people have needs. There's obviously huge pushes for sort of how increased numbers of houses and infrastructure requirements and things like that. But also we're going through this catastrophic biodiversity crisis and climate crisis that means we need to be protecting and supporting our wild spaces. So I think people have, throughout this COVID pandemic, have really sort of reconnected with nature. They've realised how valuable these wild spaces and places are for them to get out into the out into the fresh air, out into the outdoors, and away from being too cooped up indoors, and making the most of their daily exercise, and all that kind of stuff. So I think people, there's that passion from people at the moment to try and do more. How can we help nature? And there's a whole host of conservation efforts that you can and sort of surveying that you can assist with, like your garden bird survey from like RSPB, and do butterfly counts and all that kind of stuff, but also rewilding your garden. People's gardens are a valuable asset for wildlife, and in fact we've run courses at Wildwood, teaching people how to rewild your gardens, and I think that's hugely important, because if everyone just did something in their garden, or in their sort of local wildlife area, even if that's just reporting the sightings of species that they found and things, it's just reconnecting people with nature, and it's then making it sort of as one, without sounding too silly. You become one with nature, as opposed to it being two separate elements, people and nature. It's how can we combine that together? And I think we need to ride the crest of the wave at the moment, where people are really, really valuing their wild spaces and want to do more to help.
I think certainly, yeah. I think even though I guess I am the conservation representative of my family, I kind of even looking around and seeing my parents, the number of times I go into the kitchen and catch them watching birds out the window, which they would maybe do on a Sunday morning while reading the paper or something, but now we'll be sitting actively Googling, I think that was a woodpecker, or I think that was a fieldfare. It's nice to see this kind of combination of everything coming together in a nice way, and hopefully that's something we can continue to push going forward, especially with kind of the new there's new discussions popping up all the time in Scotland with things like the links and all sorts. So hopefully we can keep momentum going and start to get more of these projects the kind of attention and off of the ground as well. I guess going back to the kind of Wilder Blean project, I wondered, we've been talking a lot about now and looking back on the past year. Looking forward, what are the kind of long-term goals for the project? What kind of things would you like to see, say, 10 years down the line that the project has achieved?
Well, we're hoping that this project is a long-term commitment. I mean, we've got obviously funding, the initial funding from People's Postcode Lottery via their Dream Fund, and that was largely for all of the infrastructure. There's a huge amount of infrastructure that needs to go in place, but we're hopeful that this project will continue and be successful. So having the extensive monitoring program, looking at all of the impacts and the benefits, and sort of tracking those changes, will then really sort of prove why we're doing it. And we have an idea of what we'd like to see happening, but we'd like that to be backed up by science, and supported by the science and all the evidence. So we're hopeful that this project will continue for many years. We're also looking at, because this is like a pioneer project, this is the first of its kind, using European bison in Britain. So we kind of want to go through all of the, we're going through all of the motions with all of the obviously statutory nature conservation organisations, all of the legislation stuff, looking at all the infrastructure and that kind of stuff. So we want to make this easier to be replicated in the future for other organisations at other reserves. So we want to look at all the licensing that's required, which we are in lengthy discussions, talking about what we need and require. But once we've kind of done all the hard work, all the legwork, as it were, then we hope that, because those discussions have already been had and made, that it makes it easier for other organisations in the future. So our hope and ambition is that this can be replicated at other sites, across the UK. And the ultimate ideal is that the bison do their job, do the fantastic work that we predict they will do, and then we have an increase in biodiversity on the site, and we're looking at sort of exploring ecotourism options for the future to sort of get allow people to then get up, see the project and understand the project sort of firsthand, And so, yeah, it's hugely exciting, the prospects of the future for the project. But we'll see how it all goes.
Yes, I think it's really inspiring, I guess, personally as well. It's interesting to me, being someone who grew up in a UK where I've seen bison before, but only ever in a kind of zoo setting. It would be interesting to see, even if within one generation of me, with my kids, future down the line, they might be able to see one wandering around in a more wild setting. So that's kind of a nice kind of within one generation kind of jump, which is really encouraging. That kind of brings me to my final question for you, which is, if there's somebody sitting at home who's been listening to the interview today and kind of has somehow not managed to hear of your project already, I don't know if that's possible, but if they haven't, and they think, oh, I want to kind of get involved, I want to support it, I want to learn more, what kind of things would you encourage them to do at home to kind of support your similar project?
So, I mean, if there's people that aren't aware of the project or want to learn more about it, then of course head to our website, so Wildwood Trust's website, or Kent Wildlife Trust's website as well, where we've got a dedicated page, talking about the wild Blean, and there's a whole host of frequently asked questions and things like that. And we will be putting updates on our sites as well. Supporting both organisations, so supporting Wildwood Trust either, by becoming members, all of the financial support that people can provide go straight into our sort of, our conservation work for the future. There's also, the opportunity in the future, there'll be like volunteer opportunities that come up. So whether that's doing some of the sort of livestock check-in, or working under our sort of bison, under the supervision of our bison rangers, there'll be, it could be carrying out some of the surveying work, for example. So there will be sort of volunteer opportunities. Again, just get in contact with both organisations to sort of find out more. And just, shout about the project, just talking about it, just starting that discussion about the wild Blean, or about wilding in general. It just, when people are talking about it, then it's at the forefront of people's minds, and you then end up with that more, increased momentum to then push forward more wilding projects, and people understand them more. They're not as sort of, not scared, but sort of not put off by them, because they've got that better understanding. So yeah, there's a whole host of ways of people can get behind the project and support us, and hopefully in the future, with if we can go down the route of the ecotourism side of things, and come and visit, come and see firsthand the work, and come to Wildwood. We are a visitor attraction. Hopefully we'll be able to open soon, in light, obviously, the COVID pandemic. We've had to close, but yeah, come see what we're all about, what we're doing at Wildwood, and the conservation work that we carry out, and our aim is to have raised platforms so that you can look out onto the Blean, because the great thing about Wildwood is it is part of the Blean forest complex. So we are sort of adjoining where the bison will be within the Wilder Blean enclosure. So it's just a fantastic collaboration between Kent Wildlife Trust and Wildwood.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for your time today. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you so much for the invite, and hopefully your listeners will have learned more about the Wilder Blean. But if there is anything that anyone wants to know, then head to our websites, and we can ensure that they find out more.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Welcome back. Thank you so much for listening to that interview. I really, really hope you enjoyed Vicky's insights there, not just on the bison, but also on the water voles as well. I think all of these species incredibly important, incredibly interesting, and often underappreciated. And so I hope that hearing about them has inspired you to do a little bit more research, think about them a little bit more. And if it has, of course, I'll put the links to all of the things we discussed in the description. I know personally, I have been in love with bison for a very long time. They always used to be one of my favourite things to see when we would go to different kind of safari parks and zoos, especially when you were in a drive-through scenario where I was sat in the back of a car, a very tiny child, looking out at these big, massive herbivores that were so incredibly 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, felt like a million times bigger than me, staring back at me. It was just, they're just incredibly awe-inspiring species. So I really hope you have gained this extra appreciation and do want to go and look a little bit more into them. But that does, unfortunately, bring us to the end of this week's show. So, if you want to support the show, please follow us on social media at Pangolin Podcast on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and make sure to follow us on your podcast streaming service of choice as well, so you don't miss out on any future content. Next week, I'll be joined by Michael Knight, one of the directors of Fife Zoo, very, very close to me, just a few miles up the road. We discuss a whole lot of things, from zebra to the role of zoos in the modern kind of conservation movement, what role they should take on, and a big long conversation as well about how you even go about setting up an organisation of this nature, because I think it's something I was certainly very interested in and didn't know very much about. So it was a real pleasure to be able to talk to him all about that. So yes, make sure to tune in if that sounds interesting to you for the next episode of Pangolin. All that remains for me to do now is wrap up. So, once again, thank you very much for listening.